Welcome back to Old School Sports and our Out of the Park Baseball 25 series, Can We Save the Oakland A's? And unfortunately here in the 2035 season, we have not saved the Oakland A's. For the first time in 5 seasons, we are not going to be in the playoffs. A losing record in September, particularly a very rough stretch over the last 2.5 weeks of September doomed this team to finish 84-78 this year, tied with the Angels, 19 games behind the Rangers. We knew midway through this season that we were likely not going to catch the Rangers, so it was all about the wild card spots for us. And unfortunately, we finished 3 games out of the final wild card spot in the American League this season. So a disappointing result, just the second time in the past 7 seasons where this team is not going to be in the postseason. The projections at the beginning of this season had us being a 100-win team for the first time ever. So definitely disappointing, and we'll see if we can make some moves this upcoming offseason to bounce back. Had 3 goals with ownership this offseason, or for this regular season, with very mixed results. Ownership wanted us to win the championship this year. Clearly we failed at that. That was an average importance to ownership, so certainly Mr. Fisher won't be disappointed with us not only not winning the championship, but not even making the playoffs. Alejandro Landin, who we will be talking about shortly when we do our annual season review in this episode, had a outstanding first full season in the majors at second base, and we should get great marks for the upgrade that he's given us at second base. Unfortunately for us, that was a low priority goal from Mr. Fisher, so while we'll get a nice check in the right direction on that one, it's not as important to him as winning the championship or increasing fan interest, and that was his highest priority goal, very high priority. Fortunately, we did focus on that a bit, both in the offseason and during the season, and we did improve by 14 points there. It's in the green rather than the blue, but still a decent result there. So despite the disappointment of not making the playoffs and not winning the championship, and despite the fact that we're going to probably have one of the biggest losses we've ever had financially with this team, given that we spent more money on our payroll than we've ever spent this year. We moved all the way up to 27th in payroll after normally being last 30th throughout most of this playthrough. Hopefully that loss of money won't result in him cutting us back too much. Would love to keep this budget moving in the right direction with the good run we've had with this team over the past several seasons, and this does mark our 5th consecutive winning season, 6th in 7 years, even though it's the first time of those 6 winning seasons that we won't be in the playoffs. Hopefully the good track record that we've generally had on the field will encourage him to not mess with our budget too much if we end up losing some money this year, which we undoubtedly will. And as always, I appreciate all the thoughts and feedback and comments on the season. I think there's probably 2 popular themes, and they both involve the pitching, which has generally been our strength throughout this playthrough. Theme number 1, and I agree with it from multiple viewers, is that we need to improve our starting pitching next year. Although we finished 4th in the American League in runs allowed, which was very solid, our starters' ERA was 12th, and that is not an area that we have typically been. And the other point, and I agree with this one, is we were 13th in the American League in the amount of walks that our batters gave up, trying to improve the starting pitching while also improving the control of our pitchers, notably our starters, should probably primary be our focus for this offseason. Although the offense finished middle of the pack, seventh in runs scored, we're hitting a lot more home runs than normal. And we've got a good core group of pretty solid players, about half of them who we picked up through trades or free agency, mostly trades, and about half of whom have now come up through our organization that are pretty useful offensive players. So I think getting the pitching back on track is likely to be our primary goal for this offseason. The defense was once again really good. Second in defensive efficiency, second in zone rating. That was not the problem this year. So hopefully we can figure out a way to improve our starting pitching. And if we're able to do that, hopefully we'll have this team back in the playoff hunt in 2036 and hopefully ultimately playing October baseball. So before we start taking a look at our pitching and our position players and talking about our preliminary plan for the offseason, and it's always useful when our loyal viewers give me feedback on these topics in the comments. Take a quick look at the playoff situation in the American League. Rangers with the best record in baseball and the Blue Jays with the byes. The Reds and the Giants with the byes in the National League. The White Sox, who won the AL Central, will be hosting the Yankees, and the Royals won the AL Central. They'll be facing the Orioles, and then the Yankees will be facing off against the Chicago White Sox. The Yankees, the White Sox, and the Orioles were the teams that we were battling with those final couple weeks of the season, along with the Rays, and unfortunately for us in Oakland and the people in Tampa, the A's and the Rays are the teams that came up short. Over in the National League, Rockies will be facing off against the Cardinals, and the Padres against the Phillies in the wild card series here in 2035. So we'll start off with the pitching staff, which, as I said, fourth in the American League in runs allowed. Overall did its job, but the starting pitching was not as good as we had hoped. You're going to see some high ERAs here among some of the bullpen guys, but that's because several of those players were used in the starting rotation for large stretches of this season. So some of those bad stats, actually the vast majority of some of those bad stats among the relievers were actually as starters. Our ace, Jackson Ferris, was definitely not the problem. The soon-to-be 32-year-old led the American League with 34 wins, 34 games started. I wish he had 34 wins. And a 246 BABIP against him. 13-9 record, 376 ERA, over 200 strikeouts as he usually is. 114 ERA plus, 96 FIP minus, 2.9 WAR. Not a great season, but certainly he was not the problem with our pitching staff. He's making pretty good money going forward. Getting difficult for us to potentially justify that salary, but if we don't have better options, and as we'll talk about when we go through the rest of the starters, we probably don't have too many better options. If we're trying to remain competitive next year, probably got to bring Ferris back and hope he can be even better. Jason DeCaro was our number 2 starter much of this year, and he had what I think is probably his worst season since he's joined us in Oakland. 10-11 record with an ERA of close to 5 on the season. His ERA plus in negative territory for the first time in his run with us. His FIP minus has been negative before, or below average more accurately before. Only a 1.6 WAR. His Sierra was over a run better than his actual ERA. When we look at his WAR, it wasn't his worst season in Oakland, but it also certainly wasn't his best. He'll be 30 early next year. Not making tons of money at $5.5 million, so would think that he'll be back with us next year. The hope is maybe he's more of a 4th or 5th starter for us next year than the number 2 guy that he was this year. And I think we will certainly be able to demote him at least to number 3 because Kevin Patterson, who we picked up in that big trade with the Marlins, was a combined 10-10 between the Marlins and the A's, but 4-2 with a 3.06 ERA for us in 12 games. Put up a WAR of almost 1 for us in the 2+ months he was on the team. Not an ace by any stretch of the imagination, but a good, solid major league pitcher. Heading into his arbitration years, so he's going to be making more money next season. Could be a guy that we might look to try to lock up for the medium term. Not an ace, as I said, but certainly I think he's better than DeCaro at this point, and we'll likely try to give him an opportunity to be a full-time starter for us next year. Gabe Brewster, another guy who we picked up in a trade, 13-8 record with a 4.67 ERA between the White Sox and Oakland. Not bad. Unfortunately, he was worse after he came over to join us. 4-4 record, ERA of over 5, and allowed 11 home runs in just 62 1/3 innings pitched. We were concerned about his fly ball tendencies, and honestly, it looks like his ability to keep the ball in the ballpark has actually regressed a bit since we brought him on board. We liked him because we thought he was better than Mike Lambert, whose stuff and velocity had really fallen apart and was the cornerstone of the trade to bring Brewster here. And we also like that he's got a lot of real positive aspects in the clubhouse, and he's also extremely popular. But in a perfect world, I'd love to not have him in the rotation next year. I don't know how practical that is, given that with a salary of a little over $2 million, he's likely to be one of the cheapest potential starting options we have. But I do have some concerns about his proclivity to give up home runs, and I don't think those are magically going to change. The one thing that did work out for us was Bobby Garland this year. And Garland is actually a guy who has as bad control of anyone on our major league team. I don't typically like to have low control pitchers, but we have, through the course of this playthrough, seemed to run into some problems maximizing the control of all of the prospects that have come up through our system. So that's something that we hope will get better. But Garland got his first opportunity in the majors this year, did a really nice job for us as a long reliever out of the bullpen for most of the season, putting up an ERA of the mid-2s as a reliever. And he basically did the same thing in 5 starts for us at the end of the year. 105 strikeouts and 96 innings pitched, 2.62 ERA, 1.6 WAR on the season. Lots of positive things that he did do for us. Now the walks are really sickly with 53 and 96 innings. He benefited from only giving up 4 home runs. I don't know that he's on the top of my list of guys to be in the rotation for next year because the control does scare me a bit. But he's a guy who will be making the major league minimum next year. He'll only be 25 when the season gets underway, and certainly should have a spot on the roster. The question is whether it will be in the rotation or the bullpen. And I guess the other question that we'll be thinking about is if we do try to improve the control of some of the pitchers on our team or their ability to keep the ball in the park, will Brewster or Garland have any trade value if we decide we might want to move on from one or both of those guys this offseason? Turning to the bullpen, Luke Little was a guy we thought we might move on from after we had him as a rental in 2034. Instead, we ended up signing him to a 2-year contract, and he did a really nice job for us as a closer this year. Led the AL with 67 games pitched, had 40 saves, which was second in the league, 2.35 ERA, put up a WAR of close to 2. Good solid season from Little. Importantly, we did not give him the no trade clause that he was looking for in that contract, even though we have traded away our longtime third baseman Colt Keith to free up some money. We've also brought on a few guys headed into their arbitration years, and we've talked about one of them already with Brewster, actually two of them already with Brewster and Patterson, and we'll be talking about several offensive players who could have some big arbitration numbers this upcoming offseason as well. And because of that, Little is a guy that if we need to clean up some salary, and he's got a decent amount of trade value, as much as we think it's important to have a closer we're confident in, he is another one of the guys on our team whose control is not necessarily ideal. So I wouldn't rule out including him in a trade this offseason. Chris Carl, another lefty guy who came up through our organization, led the AL this year with 24 holds, but he also had a 6-9 record, so 9 losses for a reliever, not exactly ideal. 30 shutdowns, but 15 meltdowns, so he was really in the middle of it pretty much every time he went out there. Overall hit a 4.44 ERA, and he was below replacement level. So after a really good season and a half, his first two parts of 2 seasons in the majors, his second full season and his third year in the majors overall was certainly more eventful, but probably not successful, as his ERA jumped by more than 2 runs from a year ago. That said, Carl probably will be back with us next year, particularly if we end up moving on from the left-hander Little. Levi Sterling is a guy who spent a good chunk of the year in the rotation for us, started 21 of the 34 games that he played in, 4.80 ERA, struck out 9.5 batters per 9 innings. His Sierra was a run less than his ERA, but still was barely above replacement level. Taking a look at his pitching splits, 5.28 ERA as a starter over those 21 games, an ERA of less than 1 as a reliever. Didn't really seem like the move of him into the rotation worked out the way that we hoped. So in all probability, I think he'll be back, but in a bullpen role next year. Jeremy Scholl, a year after being an all-star for the first time and winning the Mariano Rivera Award, had a solid season, but certainly not as good as he was a year ago. 3.82 ERA over 63 2/3 innings, barely above replacement level. Still think he's an important right-handed arm for our bullpen. We have him signed to a reasonable deal, particularly if he pitches back to his all-star level of a year ago. Tend to think Scholl will be with us, and hopefully he'll be a little better next year. Mike Curtis is a extremely popular player that we traded for this past offseason in our effort to improve fan interest. Unfortunately, he just was not a very good pitcher in the major leagues with an ERA of 5.54 over 37 1/3 innings. The 6 home runs and 17 walks allowed, certainly a big factor in that because his BABIP was only 280. But he seemed to give up hits when they could really hurt him, allowing 23.8 of inherited runners to score on the season, was below replacement level. Looking at his profile, I think he's back with us next year, and I think we just hope he does better. Rodolfo Quintanilla, 25-year-old who's come up through our organization, spent the whole year in the majors, 4.33 ERA over 54 innings pitched, has some positive attributes in the clubhouse. Certainly would think he will be in the mix to be on our team as long as he's making the major league minimum. Still has 2 option years left. Is he going to get a long-term contract? Probably not. Caden Dana is a guy who we gave a brief opportunity to start for us. He did really well in the bullpen this year, really horrible as a starter. It all added up to a 4.08 ERA over 88 1/3 innings pitched. But we now have a pretty proven track record with Mr. Dana that he is not good as a starter, unfortunately. We'll take a look at those pitching splits from this year, and you can see as a reliever had a 3.27 ERA. It almost doubled to 6.12 in those 5 starts that he did have for us. Dana has started at this point 22 games for us over the 5 seasons he's been in Oakland, and they've generally been disastrous. He got yanked from the rotation back in 2032. He got a random start last year. I believe it might have been on the last day of the season when we already kind of had our playoff seeding locked in. And then the 5 starts this year in August primarily that were brutal. So if he's back with us, I think he's in the bullpen. The issue is that we gave him a contract a few years ago where he's got team options these last couple years at $4 million. $4 million for a solid but relatively generic right-handed bullpen arm is getting expensive. Given that he does have the stamina to start, he does have the arsenal to start, and he does have that Iron Man injury proneness, it's possible another team may value him more than we do, so could be a guy that we could use as trade bait this offseason if need be. And it's not impossible that he'll be back with us as a right-handed arm out of the pen, but given the numbers that we've got guys like Sterling and Scholl and Curtis signed to, Dana at $4 million seems a little aggressive for us to keep around. RJ Cope, good solid left-handed arm, another guy who's come up through our organization, 3rd-round pick back in 2026, another guy who control is the issue. Walked less than a batter every 2 innings this year. Put up a 3.20 ERA across the 76 innings pitched that he did pitch for us. And he has been a pretty respectable left-handed major league reliever for us. Has had an ERA under 4 each of his 3 seasons in the majors. You may remember he also did win 10 games this year out of the bullpen, so involved in a lot of action when he really only pitched 76 innings. You may remember that Cope is a potential 2-way player, but he is not a particularly adept player, a guy who we think can luck into a home run every once in a while, but has trouble making contact with the ball, and because of that trouble making contact with the ball, he also tends to strike out an awful lot. Only got into 1 game as a 2-way player this year, and he didn't even get an at-bat. So given the improved offensive players we have in our organization, would expect that Cope will be someone who is only very occasionally used by our manager. Last guy we'll talk about is another failed starter from this season. Jamie DeVore started 20 games for us. Finished with a 5-7 record, a 4.29 ERA, 1.4 WAR on the season. He was basically an average pitcher in terms of his ERA plus and his FIP minus. He is a guy who is going to be making $6.5 million this next year. Going to have to kind of figure out whether we think it makes sense to keep him and have him in the rotation or not. Similar to Caden Dana, the amount that he's making is going to be a pretty rough amount if we just use him as a right-handed reliever. Unfortunately, similar to Caden Dana, he had a lot more success in the bullpen. A 1.78 ERA as a reliever, put up an ERA of over 5 as a starter this year. So we're going to have some interesting questions. I like a lot of the pitchers on this team, and we've kind of built the staff over the years with a lot of depth and versatile guys that we felt like we could swap in and out of the rotation. Unfortunately, this year, guys like Sterling and Dana and DeVore in particular, and DeCaro to some extent, and Brewster as well, weren't necessarily particularly effective when they got the chances to start. So we've got a lot of redundancy in the rotation in terms of guys who have enough stamina and have decent enough pitching arsenals to start for us if they need to. The problem is that you could argue that most of those guys are fourth or fifth starter types when you look at their skill set, and they're probably fifth starters or AAA starters when you look at their performance over this past year. So I don't hate the pitching staff overall. As we talked about, we were fourth in the league in runs allowed when all was said and done, so I don't think we need to make massive shifts. But if we can improve the number of walks we allow a bit by maybe moving on from a player or two that are more prone to giving up walks, maybe move on from a guy like Brewster who gives up a lot of home runs, and ultimately add a more front end of the rotation type of starter into the mix with Ferris, Patterson, and likely DeCaro, who are the three who in all probability will be back in the rotation next year. If we can add in a number 2 or a number 3 starter that we feel pretty confident about through trade or free agency, most likely, given that we still have the lowest budget in baseball, it will be via trade. That could be the big move that we need to make this offseason, and it may entail packaging up a couple of the pitchers that we've talked about that do have some value for one guy who's a little bit better. If we can pull off a trade like that, that might be a step in the right direction for this pitching staff. So before we turn to the everyday players, and the position players are actually interesting because we've talked a lot about how our pitching staff was pretty good when all was said and done, but we want to make a lot of changes there. I almost feel like it might be a little opposite with the position players. We were middle of the pack, 7th in the league in runs scored this year, but I think I'm going to feel pretty comfortable bringing back most of these players with just a couple changes on the margins of the roster. And outside of one series, there was not a lot of drama in the wild card series. 3 sweeps, the Rockies taking out the Cardinals, the Padres taking out the Phillies, and the Orioles taking out the Royals. The Yankees won the first game of their series against the White Sox, but then the White Sox bounced back to take 2 in a row and move on to face the team that has been our nemesis in the division the last few years, the Texas Rangers. So turning our attention back to our position players who this year were really good at hitting home runs and a little bit above average in terms of scoring runs overall. Dave Ackley, the catcher we signed to a long extension after 9 games in the majors this past offseason, was our regular starter over 60% of the time this year. Hit just 236, and honestly, we're a little disappointed in the home run power. We thought he'd be able to knock the ball out of the park more than he did. He combined for 44 homers last year and 114 ribbies between AAA and the majors, but only 6 homers this year and 356 at-bats. Ended up putting up a 73 WRC plus. He was a little above replacement level. But certainly we're hoping for more offense from Mr. Ackley. Looking at his profile, I think it's not unreasonable to think that he'll be a better offensive player next year. But his performance through the first season plus of his career has not been as good at the plate as we would have hoped. Jaden Boakai, who was last year's starter, ended up starting 64 games this year. We played him a little more frequently over the second half of the season. Unfortunately, as we played Boakai more often, his batting performance really dipped. 227 average with 4 homers in his 220 at-bats. 63 WRC plus and a 0.4 WAR driven by his excellent defense. He's a guy who's headed into his arbitration years. His arbitration number had been close to $4 million at the start of this season and even in the early stages. So that difficult offensive season that he has made him a lot more reasonable. Given his excellent defense, might be a guy that we look to lock up. I feel like we've got two solid young catchers in Ackley and Boakai. I honestly wish that I strongly preferred one of them over the other. Obviously prefer Boakai defensively. Still think that Ackley, however, is going to hit more home runs and draw more walks and ultimately be a more effective offensive player. So I don't hate the situation at catcher, but it's certainly not perfect. Andy Brailovsky is a guy who we picked up in the big trade that brought us the pitcher Patterson from the Marlins when we traded away Byron Brain as well as several other assets. Brailovsky with us this year was okay, a 104 WRC plus after we picked him up, 275 average, 7 homers and 204 at-bats. 26-year-old set to be making about $6.5 million in arbitration next year. Looking at his batting profile, tend to think he will be our first baseman next year. But the fact that he put up just a 103 WRC plus this year in his 4th full major league season, split between Miami and Oakland, after he was over 120 each of the previous 2 seasons, has me a little bit concerned. But he is a guy who we think can hit for a decent average with some power, and hopefully we'll get more offensively out of him next season, because I think that left-handed bat could be an important asset for us, particularly against right-handed pitching. And another guy who we traded for, like Brailovsky, is Luis Lujan. Lujan did a really nice job for us. Unfortunately, he is a pure rental in all probability and will likely not be back with us next year. He's a guy who has led the AL in home runs 2 of the last 4 years at this point. Hit a combined 39 for us and Boston this year. 14 homers and 46 ribbies and 240 at-bats with Oakland. Put up a 129 WRC plus and a 1.3 WAR for us. Gave us the home run power that we are looking for, or were looking for. But as I said, a guy who's got over 200 home runs at the age of 27 and also has high financial ambition, is likely to be far out of our price range. Says that he's looking for $37 million a year over 9 years. So we intended Yardman Lujan to be a rental when we traded for him. We're hoping he might help lead us to a playoff appearance and maybe even a World Series, and neither of those things ended up coming true. But he did a solid job for us and will be a big bat that we're hoping having Brailovsky for the whole season may help replace. Second baseman Steve Allison is a guy who was up with us earlier in the year when we had some injuries and also a September call-up. Hit 235 in 102 at-bats, was half a win above replacement level. Respectable offensively, a solid and versatile defensive player, some positive personality traits with a high leadership and work ethic. View the 26-year-old who we picked in the 5th round out of Baylor back in 2031 as a potential good utility infielder for us for the next few years. Don't know that he'll actually be a starter for us because at second base and shortstop, we've got a couple of guys that we really love. Second base, and we touched about Landine a bit already. International free agent signing from 2027. We signed him before this past season to a contract that could be incredible for us when he was very unproven. Had a bigger rookie year than we could have ever imagined. Hit 268, 29 doubles, 35 homers, and 90 ribbies for us. put up a 121 WRC plus and a 4.7 WAR. We already on this team with Jake Ortega and Andy Toribio have a couple of relatively recent Rookie of the Year award winners, and Landine definitely seems like he could fit that bill for us. This is a guy who, I guess he did end up having 29 home runs across 3 levels in 2033. But only 18 last year combined between AAA and a brief stint in the majors. So to have 35 home runs out of him as a rookie is definitely a very positive surprise. And fortunately for us, Flea Landine looks like we have found an answer at second base for hopefully several years to come. And with the contract that he did sign for us when we certainly weren't expecting that he was going to be a guy hitting 35 home runs, could be pretty good value for us. A guy who did not end up being good value for us was Abraham Camacho. You may remember we signed the international free agent out of Cuba last offseason to a front-loaded contract, thinking he could ultimately be our Colt Keith replacement at third base. By the end of the year, he wasn't even in the starting lineup regularly. Hit just 225 with 13 homers and 463 at-bats, 76 WRC plus, and he was below replacement level. As I said, the contract was front-loaded, so he's only going to be set to make $5.7 million a year for the next 2 or 3 seasons. But given that we've brought Brailovsky on board, given that I don't love Camacho at third base, and given that we've got a couple other options to potentially be an everyday third baseman, including Rodney Mesidor or perhaps Steve Allison, who we already talked about, if Camacho has any trade value this upcoming offseason, he may be a guy that it would make sense for us to move on from rather quickly. And a player whose chances of making the roster next year are probably enhanced if we do move on from Mr. Camacho is Nelson Castellanos. Picked him up in a trade with San Francisco right before the season began. Split the year between AAA, where he played primarily, really productive with a 141 WRC plus. Brought him up in September, and he was 6 for 21 in very limited playing time, did drive in 6 runs, but only a 61 WRC plus. Only had 1 walk in the little amount of action that he did have. More of a first and third base kind of guy, but a decent looking right-handed bat who, again, while he's making the major league minimum over the next few years, likely to be vying for a roster spot. Rodney Mesidor, who was the prime guy that we got back when we did the largely salary dump of Colt Keith, ended up having 173 major league at-bats for us. Hit just 237, only 2 homers and 19 ribbies, a 67 WRC plus, and he was below replacement level. Certainly in the mix to compete for the starting job at third base next year. But based on his performance, I could see guys like Castellanos and Steve Allison competing with him for that role. In theory, Israver Stewart might be competing as well. He was up with us most of last season, or actually all of last season, even though he was a part-time player. This year, primarily in AAA, where he was productive offensively. Only 1 for 3 with a double and a ribby at the major league level. So very productive, but in a almost irrelevant sample size, unfortunately. He is a guy who is out of options at this point. We actually had to put him through waivers to get him down to AAA this year, and nobody claimed him. Certainly in the mix to be a 5th or 6th infielder for us next year, but I don't think, unlike Mesidor, Castellanos, and Allison, I don't really think Stewart's a serious candidate to be our starting third baseman. And then the last infielder is arguably the best of the bunch, and that's our shortstop, Andy Toribio. Was the American League Rookie of the Year winner and an All-Star a year ago. Followed up an excellent rookie season with an even better sophomore season. 269 average, 29 doubles, 25 homers, stole 24 bases, put up a 118 WRC plus and a 5.4 WAR. So as we think about the offense holistically, feel like we've got Brailovsky at first, Landine at second, and Toribio at short. A pretty good hitting trio, and with Toribio and Landine at short and second, pretty solid defense as well. Third base is a little bit of an open position after we moved on from Colt Keith a couple of months ago, but as we talked about, Allison, Castellanos, Mesidor, Stewart, all potentially in the mix to varying degrees. And if we kept Camacho around, he could be in the mix too. But I think if there's a trade value of any of these five guys we just talked about, they could be relatively short for their tenure as continued members of the Oakland A's. But again, I feel like we're pretty solid at catcher, and we're pretty solid at 3 infield spots, and we've got a couple guys who at worst are backups. It's just a matter of figuring out what we're going to do at third base after Colt Keith has held down that position incredibly well for us for close to 7 years. And we'll finish up turning our attention to the outfielders. And similar to the infielders, I don't feel like there's necessarily a ton we're going to need to do here. Could maybe make one change on the margins, but it's a crew that, given some of the outfields we've had over the years, is in pretty good shape. Unfortunately, as you can see, 2 of our key players finished the season in a slump, which was certainly not optimal as we were fighting for a playoff appearance. Brady Harris, picked him up in a big trade with Washington before this past season. Had 32 doubles, 31 homers for us, drove in over 80 runs, scored almost 100, stole 17 bases, all added up to a 121 WRC plus and a 4.8 WAR. He is a guy who's going to be making significant money next year, $14 million in what will likely be his final year before free agency. We knew he was a kind of medium-term rental when we picked him up, but coming off of the good season that he came off, both offensively and in the field, where he was certainly a well above average left fielder and right fielder, and he wasn't embarrassing when we had to play him in center from time to time. I think that he'll be an important part of our offense next year. Luis Taveras, right-handed hitting corner outfielder, has been a starting player in our lineup the last couple years against left-handed pitching, and he did a much better job this season than last year. Raised his batting average by 16 points, drew more walks, and more than doubled his number of doubles to 17. Although he hit fewer home runs and drove in fewer runs, he scored a lot more. And overall, his 117 WRC plus was up almost 20 points from a year ago, and his WAR was up a win and a half from where it was a year ago. He is a guy who's finally arbitration eligible, so if he ends up being a fifth outfielder for us, a little over $2 million might be getting expensive. So from that perspective, he could find a roster spot in jeopardy, but it's also very conceivable he'll be back next year. Luis Lara, heading into those team option years in his early 30s, that seems like it was a long time ago when we signed him prior to the 2028 season, and we were talking about those team options in the final seasons, but time flies when you're having fun. So we'll have a decision to make on Lara this offseason. Still love the glove, still like the ability on the base paths, but he's wrecked physically, and the switch hitter's bat is not what it once was. hit 234 this year, put up a 77 WRC plus, still a 1.1 WAR, driven by his excellent defense. Would tend to think that he's probably best served at this point as a fourth outfielder or a defensive substitute or some combination of the above. The question is really money at this point. The team option at $3 million. If we're kind of viewing both Lara and Tavares as fourth and fifth outfielders, probably financially would prefer to only have one of them back and then maybe have someone making the major league minimum join them. Another guy that in theory we could move on from would be Bobby Cabral, as he's starting to make a little bit more money, set to make $4.5 million next year. Wasn't a great season from Cabral, but it was still a significant bounce back from where he was a year ago. Got his batting average back up above the Mendoza line at 204. More than doubled his home runs from 16 to 36, and he put up a 106 OPS plus and a 101 WRC plus with a win above replacement. So he was at least not embarrassing with the bat this year. Not as good as he was his first two seasons with us in Oakland, when he was about 10% above average as an offensive player. But at least it wasn't the disastrous season and a repeat of what he did in 2034 here in 2035. And last, but of course not least, we will go like Vanessa Williams, and we will save the best for last. And we will do that checking in on last year's American League MVP. And that, of course, is Jake Ortega, third pick overall in 2029 out of Oregon State. And he had another monster season for us this year, although his WAR dipped from a league best 9.4 to 7.8 this year. Still hit 323 for us, 91 runs scored, 113 ribbies. 34 doubles, 12 triples, 31 home runs. The triples and the home runs both career highs. And he also stole a career high 37 bases, so he joined the 30-30 club. All added up to a 162 WRC plus. Another guy who is a pretty talented defensive outfielder. Surprised actually that his zone rating was only in the average range in left field, but a more than competent left fielder and center fielder for us defensively this year. The only concern about him is his fragility. He did have some injuries that final week of the season when we were fighting for the playoff spots. Actually, it was not necessarily the final week. I think it might have been the week before the final week. But regardless, he was a little banged up down the stretch when everything was falling apart. But would expect Mr. Ortega to once again receive some votes for the Silver Slugger and the MVP awards again this offseason. As we talked about, he was the 2032 AL Rookie of the Year. We had the 2034 AL Rookie of the Year with Andy Toribio, and would expect that Alejandro Landin will ultimately get some pretty significant support for that award this upcoming offseason. So I think the moves as far as the position players are a little more on the margins than they would be with the pitching staff. We'll have to see what the free agent class looks like. We'll have to see what the opportunities are like in the trade market. And we'll have to see what kind of value our players have in the trade market, because that could certainly change the direction that we end up going when we do get to the postseason. Before we move on through the divisional series, we'll take a very quick preview look at the potential upcoming free agents. Not that we're likely to be playing at the highest end of the market. We almost certainly won't. But position player wise, several interesting guys out there. Jackson Holliday, PCA, Luis Lujan, Bobby Witt Jr., and Moises Ballesteros. Some of the top guys, but some other pretty familiar names even here more than a decade into the future, with Yordan Alvarez, Harry Ford, Riley Green, Vlad Guerrero Jr., and Julio Rodriguez, among others, headed to free agency this upcoming offseason. Our longtime catcher, Drake Baldwin, also going to be on the market again. Not that I think that is a significant need for us at this point. And if we're going to be looking for a starting pitcher, I think it's going to be more realistic for us to try to do that in the trade market. Some of the guys on the market, Brayan Bello, Hunter Brown, Rosny Contreras, are getting older at this point and not necessarily really difference makers. The top guy, Spencer Strider, looking for $26 million a year and wrecked physically, is probably going to be out of our price range. Several pretty good relievers also going to be on the market as well. It is kind of interesting that Bryce Renfroe, who plays in our division for Houston, and Emmanuel Clase, who plays in our division for the Rangers, supposedly we only have low scouting accuracy on those two guys, which is a little weird because you look at their stats for this past season and they both basically look like they played full seasons in the majors, so we certainly faced them many times. But those are the vagaries of OOTP. Tend to think that if we're going to be making a significant move with the starting pitchers this offseason, it may be via the trade market rather than free agency. But a lot of time for us to figure that out. We could always even shoot for a reunion with our old buddy Bubba Chandler if we wanted to. And we had some strange results in the divisional series. The wild card teams, the Rockies and the Padres in the National League, both swept the teams with home field advantage and the best records in the NL. So a couple of NL West rivals are going to be facing off in the National League Championship Series. In the American League, the wild card Orioles took out the Blue Jays, so the only favorite that moved on was our divisional rivals, the top team in baseball, the Texas Rangers, who will have home field advantage against the Orioles after they took out the White Sox in 4 games. And before we finish the episode, I was almost remiss and didn't mention another important bat that we're going to have next year, and the guy that really makes the potential to move on from Mr. Lujan very realistic for us, and that's Juan Ramos. We picked him up in a trade with Seattle in July, knowing he'd be out for the year, but did view him as a potential big-time player for us offensively next year. He is certainly going to be in the mix at first base and DH. We're down to low scouting accuracy on him because he missed the entire season with that injury. But he had a very impressive rookie year for Seattle in 2034. If it wasn't for the great season we had from Toribio, probably would have been a stronger contender for Rookie of the Year. Hoping that his profile looks real similar to how it looks today. He is a poor defensive first baseman, not a lot of speed, not the best personality in the world, but we think he can potentially be an incredible hitter for us, and certainly having Ramos in the mix next year will help, we hope, our offense take a big step forward, even if we're not necessarily going to be incredibly active in the free agent market this offseason. So with that, we will call it an episode. Next time around, we will do a deep dive on our farm system. We'll also check in on some of the top young prospects in baseball that we've looked at in previous drafts and IAFA pools. And we'll also investigate how some of our former players are doing. We made a lot of trades over the last 12 months or so of game time, and see who did well and who has struggled in their new locations here in the 2035 season. And we'll also find out who ends up winning the World Series this year. And then we'll be in the episode after next getting into the offseason in full detail. Until then, thanks so much for watching, and hope you have a great day.